Hi guys, it's Miss Linnea Lark, and today I've got an underglaze tutorial for you. I'll be teaching you how to make opaque designs as well as watercolor designs. Because I'll be doing watercolor designs, it's a good idea always to have a light, if not white, background color everywhere. So what you'll be noticing is that I am doing 3 coats of white underglaze and making sure that each of those layers dries sufficiently before I move on to the second and third layers. Now that I've got my background done, I can start to use my references to draw my design. Solid or opaque areas should have 3 layers of underglaze. As I mentioned before, it is essential that if you want your piece to be solid and opaque, that you have to do 3 good layers of underglaze. Each layer must be completely dry before you do the next layer. If you apply underglaze to wet underglaze, you'll actually be wiping off as much underglaze as you're putting on, and so you'll still only have 1 layer of underglaze, even though it seems like you've done 2 coats. So be patient and make sure that your layers are dry before you apply. If you notice, I'm tallying my layers on my wheel. This helps me keep track if I'm busy talking to people or helping students while I'm working, and the same for you. So when you finish doing a layer, take note of it, and that way you don't forget how many layers you've done. Very often I get students who have patchy areas. It's because they weren't paying attention to what they were doing, in the order that they were doing it, and how many applications they've actually applied. So pay attention to what you're doing, have a planned sequence, an order that you're going to be applying the underglaze with, and then keep track of how many layers you've applied. Line work should be the top layer, and don't skimp on your layers for the line work. You always need 3. No matter if you're doing shapes or lines, you need 3 layers. Notice how I stabilize my hand, especially when I'm painting in the air like I am, as you see here. I always make sure that the hand that I'm painting with can be sturdy on top of something. And in this case, the wheel wasn't quite high enough, and so I've put my left hand underneath my right hand to prop it up a little bit higher and to keep it stable so that my lines are really clean and not really wobbly. When choosing colors, it's a good idea to make sure that your values have huge steps between them. Try not to choose colors that are too close to each other, because when they get fired, everything gets a little bit darker, and so you might think that there's a lot of value and contrast, but oftentimes by the time you fire it and glaze it, there's very little contrast. So just make sure that you've got a really light color, a solid medium color, and a very dark color. This will give you good contrast. The really cool thing about underglaze is that whatever color is on top is what you'll see, as long as you've put a solid 3 layers on. In this case, if I hadn't have put 3 solid layers of red on top, you'd be able to see the whale through the red stem, which would be weird. Now I'll be showing you how to use a watercolor painting technique with underglazes. Add water to make underglaze more transparent. Don't worry about your pencil lines, they will burn off in the kiln. When I'm doing lighter areas, in the first layers, I'm usually adding a lot of water. And as I'm doing the last layers, I'm adding less water to make it a little bit more opaque. This will give me a range of values. Continue layering watered down glazes. Use a variety of values to create depth. As you're looking at my desk, you'll notice a bunch of little tubs all around the place with all different colors. So it's just a good idea if you don't want to have a Crayola, bright, almost gimmicky type of color scheme to mix your own colors. When I'm watercoloring, you can see that the light areas have 1 to 2 layers of underglaze, and they're pretty watery. The darker areas have 3 or more layers, and they have a little bit less water mixed into them to make them a little bit darker. As I'm painting, you'll notice that as the underglazes are drying, they become much lighter. A good rule of thumb is that when the underglaze is wet, by the time it's all the way done, it'll be slightly darker than what you're applying when it's wet. So it's going to get lighter as it dries. It'll get a little bit darker after it's fired. And then once you put the clear overglaze on top of it, it'll get even darker than when you were originally painting it on. When using the watercolor technique, layering should not be exact with crisp edges like we saw earlier. Layering should be more splotchy and watery looking, a little bit more intentionally imperfect. Now that all my underglaze is done, I'm going to do the first glaze firing. So now you're seeing what the piece looks like after it's come out of the first glaze firing. It's much darker than when it went into the glaze firing. And once I put on the glaze, it will get even darker yet. So before I glaze the outside, I'm going to pour red glaze into the inside to make it waterproof. I fill the pot up with glaze and carefully move it around in a circle so that it barely kisses the edge of the rim. Once I get it all the way around in a nice thick layer, I'll pour it all out as quickly as I can without drips on the outside. Any drips that I have, I will sponge away. Now for the last step, I'm going to be applying 3 layers of clear matte glaze everywhere. Make sure each layer is dry before applying the next layer. Now, before I go on to the second layer of clear matte, the clear matte glaze has little pebbles or little grit inside of it. And so I always make sure once a layer is dry, I always make sure that I go around and I feel the entire surface with clean hands and carefully rub away any little pebbles or rocks that are left behind. Once I do that, I'll apply the next layer and repeat. Now that the matte glaze is all done and I have 3 solid layers of it, I'm able to put it back in a glaze firing. And now you have the final product. So notice that as it's spinning around, you can still see the lighter areas of the petals are very thin. In some areas you can barely see them, but with multiple layers of thin watery underglaze, it starts to build up and give a watery, transparent look. Alright, that's it for glazing techniques. I hope you make some beautiful designs and then share them with me.